Good afternoon. I'm Pat Morrison in the Moan Broadcast Center. It's now been front and center on the news and in the blogs for more than a week now. The question of building a mosque near Ground Zero. There's already a mosque within about 4 blocks of that site and another about 1.5 miles away. But this one would be 2 blocks away, joining other houses of worship, a mosque and community center to be built there. The question is, for want of another word, I suppose, the seemliness of it, the idea of putting a house devoted to Islam so close to the Twin Towers, which were brought down by people who were terrorists who promoted, at least in their words, Islam. Is this like putting up a monument to David Koresh near a church, for example, in Waco? We're going to talk to you about this, the whole question of these Islamic Center near Ground Zero at 866-893-5722. New Yorkers have been polled about this, and 2/3 of them oppose the construction of the mosque, according to a Siena College poll. But by the same token, 2/3 say there's a constitutional right to build there. Where do you come down in this? How can this matter be sorted out? 866-893-5722 or on the Pat Morrison page. It's at kpcc.org. Joining me to talk about this, Sam Harris, who we've had on the program before. I welcome him back. He's co-founder and CEO of Project Reason, author of books like The End of Faith and Letters to a Christian Nation. His forthcoming book out in October is The Moral. Mr. Harris, thank you for coming back.
Thank you, Pat.
And Reza Aslan, editor at the Daily Beast. We've heard him here before, too. Internationally acclaimed writer, scholar. His latest book, Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in the Age of Globalization. Thank you for coming back as well.
Thanks, Pat. Great to be back.
And on the Daily Beast, Mr. Harris, you write about how President Obama has positioned himself in this and talk about opposing the mosque and how people may have done perhaps the right thing for the wrong reasons.
Actually, I should point out that I wrote my article before Obama made his statement, and then it got sort of slanted as a response to him by the editor. So that was somewhat misleading. But
it's always the editors.
Yeah, well, with titles and intros, it always is. But I should say I don't have any special concern about this mosque. I'm not, as you know, I'm not a fan of mosques in general, or synagogues and churches for that matter, because I think they have less to do with our deepest wisdom at this point, and rather a lot to do with divisive ignorance that we should outgrow. But I think people are noticing that it is, at least in bad taste, to build a mosque so close to Ground Zero. But I don't for a moment think there should be laws against this kind of bad taste, and certainly American Muslims should be free to build a mosque wherever churches and synagogues would be allowed. So in that sense, we can probably stop the conversation right where President Obama wanted to, with just a mere acknowledgement of the First Amendment. But what does worry me, and which was really at the core of my article, is this idea that any noticing of a unique problem with Islam at this point in history is a sign of bigotry, and this idea seems to be universally subscribed by my fellow liberals, and it's quite a destabilizing and I think dangerous idea. And in fact, no one should be more concerned about the unique liabilities of Islam at this moment than so-called moderate Muslims. I mean, no one suffers more from Muslim terrorism and bullying and intolerance and misogyny and the stirrings of theocracy that we see throughout the Muslim world than other Muslims. And it's simply not a sign of intolerance to notice this.
Well, then let's talk to Reza Aslan as well, who, as I said, is an editor at the Daily Beast and the author of a number of books and a guest who you've heard here in the past. Is it, as Sam Harris says, do you think something that moderate Muslims should be saying, we acknowledge and of course we have a constitutional right, but there is a question of taste and choice in this, and that may be interpreted as being in your face by people who now all the more will not make a distinction between moderate and extreme Islam?
Well, let's get our facts straight here. This is not a mosque, and I can't understand why people keep referring to it as such. It's being built by the Cordoba Initiative, which is a multi-faith nonprofit organization. Its purpose is to improve relations between Muslims and all religions, but also it's meant to be a place of interfaith dialogue, a place to promote peace and tolerance, particularly between the 3 faiths of Abraham, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's 13 stories. It has a museum, a community center. On the board of advisors are Christians and Jews. There are Hindus and Buddhists who are involved in the construction of it. Yes, there is a space amongst these 13 stories in which Muslims can pray, but there's also place for worship for Christians and for Jews as well. So the idea that this is about a mosque being built at ground zero, I think, is a deliberately false way of putting it.
Well, who's paying for it, though? Who's paying for it, Mr. Aslan?
Well, it's a private property that hasn't actually been paid for yet. The purpose of it is that it's going to cost, a lot of money, and that money is going to come from contributors all around the world. The New York Charities Bureau and both the U.S. and also the U.S. Treasury Department have already been enlisted to review all of the donor lists to assure that all funding sources are going to be vetted. The trustees and the advisory board are going to go through every single funding. So I also think that this question about where the funding comes is also kind of a red herring. The larger point, though, is, the question that you asked is about this idea of the difference between religious freedoms and sensitivity. I personally believe that there can be no but in the sentence, I believe in religious liberties. But, this idea that constitutional rights should be somehow privy to the sentiments of people or the sensitivities of people, something that has just been absolutely rejected. I mean, we don't put to a vote whether, mixed-race couples can marry each other, and we don't put to, sensitivities whether homosexuals should be able to marry one another, and we don't put to sensitivities whether people of whatever faith they are allowed to build whatever they want to build on private property. So I have a hard time accepting the argument that this is just about sensitivity, particularly, by the way, Pat, because the people who are behind the protests against the Cordoba Institute, the Stop Islamization of America, as they're known, are also fronting similar protests at Tennessee, in New York, in California, in San Diego, in Wyoming.
But
it's
let
quite clear that this is specifically about Islam.
Well, let me go back, and it may be very specifically about a specific iteration of Islam or a misinterpretation of Islam as the 9/11 terrorists conceived it. So, Sam Harris, are people able to suss out the kind of distinctions that Reza Aslan was talking about?
Well, I mean, that's the core issue is that Islam merits special concern at this point. Now, I fully agree with what Reza said about religious liberty and the Constitution and the building of mosques, and that's just that's not the core of the issue. The core of the issue is that people's fear about Islam at this moment in history is warranted, and we have to have an intelligent discussion about and nobody should be more afraid about these trends in the Muslim world than Muslims. And this, I think, will be true for quite some time. But the problem we have to get our heads around is that not every religious community is equally likely to produce an endless supply of suicide bombers or kidnap journalists and aid workers and saw their heads off or seek to perpetrate an act of nuclear terrorism. And it is not bigotry to notice this. And the people who are defending this mosque and the people who are rightly criticizing the racism and bigotry of many people on the political right in this country insist upon saying things like September 11th had nothing to do with Islam, and denying that there's anything different about Islam at this moment in its history, given its actual theology and actual doctrine, than any other religion. And that is something that is a politically correct myth that we have to find some way of penetrating, still retaining our goodwill and tolerance of diversity and our political liberalism.
All right,
frankly.
let's hear the others.
Can I respond to that for a second?
We'll hear from Nick in Monterey Park, who is going to take the opposite point of view. Nick, thank you for calling.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment that I think the issue about sensitivity is masking some pretty hardcore xenophobic attitudes. And Pat, I'd like to also point out your comment about you equating this mosque being built to McVeigh. And I also heard recently about a comparison of that there shouldn't be a swastika being built next to a synagogue. And I think those are really poor comparisons because I think we're painting the entire Muslim community with a pretty broad brush. These are fundamentalist actors, just like McVeigh was. And that's pretty much my comment. And that's it.
Okay, and Reza Aslan, you must be in agreement.
Well, yes. I mean, look, it's not bigotry to say that there are such things as, radicals and terrorists in the Islamic world. It is bigotry to compare this building of a 13-story multicultural, multi-faith center to Al-Qaeda. And that's exactly what Sam is doing here. I mean, he says quite clearly in his article, yes, I believe in religious freedom, but Islam is fundamentally different. The diversity of beliefs and practices and ideals that motivate other faiths just doesn't count when it comes to Islam. That somehow Islam, as Sam very famously said, is a cult of death. And so you can't say that, I believe in religious liberties and I believe that, people of faith should be able to build houses of worship wherever they want to, except when it comes to Islam, because Islam is different. That's the definition of bigotry.
When it comes to Islam.
Sam Harris.
Let me just clarify my position, because, as I said in my article, you should be able to build structures there that are quite a bit more offensive than a mosque. I think the KKK should be able to build their next clubhouse wherever it's appropriately zoned.
And some people take offense that there's a strip club not far away.
There's
there are two
all
strip
kinds
clubs.
of things that there's a distance between what is legal and what we should be overjoyed about. But the thing to point out about Islam, and this is a fact which Reza, you often want to pirouette around, is that it does have doctrines, specifically about martyrdom and jihad, that are massively well subscribed, and therefore, and the doctrines also about blasphemy and apostasy and the treatment of women that we're all in the 21st century right to find objectionable, and it presents a unique liability, and we are right to be uncomfortable with that. And specifically, what this mosque provokes is the fear that it will be viewed by some considerable portion of the Muslim world, who knows how many, as a kind of acquiescence on the part of the West to jihad, and that is I don't think that's enough to get us to stop building mosques in Lower Manhattan. But
then why are you bringing it up?
Well, I'm bringing it up is because what has happened is that anyone in our intellectual community generally, but especially on the left, who singles out Islam for special analysis at this moment with respect to terrorism and jihad and treatment of women, is immediately accused of bigotry, and that is in the limit, that is going to be a suicidal tendency.
All right, we'll come back with Reza Aslan and with your calls at 866-893-KPCC. Reza Aslan is responding to what it is Sam Harris said. We're talking about the Islamic Center near Ground Zero in New York City. This is 89.3 KPCC. I'm Pat Morrison. We are talking with two top thinkers about the proposal to build an Islamic center near Ground Zero in New York, the controversy it's engendered, and the questions about tolerance, how far it goes, the actual paper nature of the First Amendment, what it is that people can do versus the questions of what they really should do. We're talking about those sensitivities with you as well at 866-893-5722. People are struggling for comparisons. GP on the Pat Morrison page says maybe it's a comparison of putting up a Shinto shrine 2 blocks from the sunken ships in Pearl Harbor, although it was not Shinto, it was Japan that declared war on the United States, just as it was not the world of Islam, but these particular Muslims and their own particular practice who attacked on 9/11. So, Reza Aslan, you were responding to Sam Harris' points.
Well, I'm not going to respond to the issue of Scripture because Sam and I have had this argument on numerous occasions, and the idea that you could sort of go through a Scripture and pick out bits of savagery that's in there and then make some sort of generalization about everybody who believes in this. I think most people, rational people, reject that notion. I mean, if anyone has read Deuteronomy, for instance, which advocates the genocide of non-Jews, or the Mahabharata, which is the most bloody tract written, and people of reason understand that there is historical and cultural context, that there is a literary tradition that influences scriptures, that there are profoundly diverse ways in which over the last thousands of years, people have interpreted Scripture, and they can interpret it however they want to. What I do want to respond to, however, is this notion of bigotry. Because a bigot is, by definition, someone who stereotypes an entire people based on the actions or the beliefs of the few, who paints an entire religion, in this case of 1.5 billion people, the second largest religion in the world, based on the actions of people who live in tribal areas of Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, or Arabs who have declared war on the United States and Israel. And that's precisely what Sam is doing. Let's not make any mistake. The argument against the building...
Hang on, let Reza Aslan finish.
The argument against the building of a multi-faith center 2 blocks away from Ground Zero that is going to be run by a Sufi imam, an American Sufi imam, that is somehow a victory, or it'll be seen as a victory for, our enemies, or that Americans should necessarily be wary of that, because by definition, if it has something to do with Islam, then it must have something to do with these violent issues and these issues of misogyny or terrorism. That is, by definition, bigotry.
All right, Sam Harris.
Well, I think what we should be wary of, and I think you should be wary of it as well, Reza, is this tendency that you just displayed of putting up a firewall of false comparisons and non sequiturs against any honest discussion of the doctrine of Islam. I'm not saying all 1.2 billion Muslims are jihadists, and I'm not saying that.
Actually, Sam, you've said those exact same words.
Hang on, Mr. Aslan.
Rather than be accountable to your misremembering what I've said, let me just tell you what I think. The problem that we have to face, and you as someone who explains Islam to the world have to face, is that vast numbers of Muslims actually believe that martyrs go to paradise, and that it's a central teaching within Islam that the best thing that can possibly happen to you is to die in defense of the faith. Now, you can quibble about what constitutes an appropriate moment of defending the faith and who you should be fighting against and when, and all of that is a legitimate thing to quibble about theologically, and hopefully Muslims will do that. But the problem is that this leaves you in a position where, when you look at groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, it is not absolutely clear from the point of view of the Quran and the Hadith where they are going wrong. I mean, they're living out a very plausible version of the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. And if they were Jains or Quakers, it would be obvious where they were going wrong. They would have their religion entirely wrong. And that is a difference that we must confront in the same way we must confront the peculiarities of the Catholic Church at this moment, which are leading to a pedophile scandal unlike none other. And
gentlemen, I'd like to get to some of our listeners' comments, and then maybe we can hear from them and get reactions from you again. Liz is calling from Walnut. Liz, thank you for your call.
Thank you. I'm going to take a totally different philosophy here. I heard from another news channel that there was a Methodist church that requested a building permit to rebuild their church and has been denied within a 2-block area of the Ground Zero. I don't believe that any religious group should be able to put their building within that sacred area. I think it should be a secular area. I also believe that the laws should be metered out equally. So if one faith cannot rebuild, then no faith should be able to rebuild within the same area. I mean, it just seems fair. And building permits can be denied for many, many reasons. It doesn't have to be because they believe that the city is being biased or partisan. I think that everybody should be treated equally, and if the Muslim temple can be built, mosque can be built, then so should the Methodist. And if the Methodist can't, then neither can the mosque. That's all.
I just want to emphasize
very quickly
that the Methodist Church is being built on an area that has been zoned for reconstruction by the Ground Zero Association. That's why. Whereas the Burlington Coat Factory 2 blocks away is not. So this is not about promoting one religion against another. It's that there are zones that have been blocked out that cannot be rebuilt, that are being built by the New York City Municipal Council.
All right, on that point, let's go to Jack's point about what it is the people in New York can and cannot do. Jack, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. My point is, everybody should stay out of it except the people who live in New York. They should have the vote, and the rest of us should not. And give you a reason. I was looking at a news station last night. They had a clergy from, I think it was Seattle, talking to a minister of the Muslim faith. And this clergy of the Christian faith actually told this Muslim guy, I shouldn't have to be forced. Allah is not my God. Now, I'm not religious at all, but I know Allah is an ancient Aramaic word which the Jews use, and it means the Most High.
Well, Jack, we're talking about the rights right now of the people in New York to make these zoning decisions, and on that point, James is calling in Hollywood, and then I'm going to let everyone hear a moment from Mayor Bloomberg, too. So, James, what do you think?
Well, I do think it is in bad taste, but I think things that are in bad taste, if we truly think they're of such bad taste that they should be, not allowed, then we have a process for that. It's called obscenity. It's community standards. They can go through the courts if people feel that this is an obscenity through that. Or
I think obscenity would already have covered the fact that, as Reza Aslan pointed out, there are 2 strip clubs in virtually the same area, too. Here's what Mayor Bloomberg had to say about his attitude toward this.
9/11 did leave a permanent hole in our hearts in this city, but it did, I think, make us believe more strongly than ever in what this country stands for. We came together as a city back then, and we united as a country, and we took great pride back then in our freedoms, and our men and women in uniform have fought and died to defend them. And if we shout down a mosque and community center because it is 2 blocks away from the site where freedom was attacked, I think it would be a sad day for America.
Another voice about New York, this one coming from Ted Olson, the former Bush Solicitor General whose wife was on one of the planes, the one that crashed into the Pentagon, who said that he thinks that President Obama is right, that there is a perfect constitutional right to build here. But on the Pat Morrison page, Miho says he's a former New Yorker who lost someone he knew on 9/11. He considers this not to be about taste, but about a psychological attack on those who lost their families and New Yorkers in general. Why would you choose a site that's so close to Ground Zero? There are lots of other spaces to build this center. Reza Aslan, what about Miho's point?
Well, the Cordoba Initiative and Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf has been in Lower Manhattan, about 10 blocks away from what we call Ground Zero, for 30 years. There's already, as you said, Pat, another mosque, a small mosque, 4 blocks from Ground Zero. So I guess my question to that person is, how many blocks is enough? At what point are we going to say, well, okay, well, that's enough to deal with the sensitivities, 5 blocks or 10 blocks? It's again hard for me to sort of imagine that this is just about these issues of sensitivities when, again, the same people who are protesting the building of this community center are protesting the building of mosques all around the country.
Let me ask Sam Harris about how this, you're talking about how this might be perceived by some radical extremists in the Muslim world. Why would they see this as a gesture of spinelessness rather than a gesture of openness? Do they not make a distinction between themselves and moderate Islam?
Oh, well, they do. I'm not saying for a moment that Osama bin Laden or any acknowledged jihadist would view these supporters of this mosque as good Muslims, because they are, I think, almost entirely Sufis, and Sufism is, while we may want to celebrate it as a very moderate tendency within Islam, is actually considered a heresy more or less throughout the Muslim world, and Sufis suffer mightily because of it. And they've had their mosques recently blown up in Pakistan. As have other moderates like the Ahmadis in Pakistan. So I think it's not that it's a straightforward victory for the forces of jihad, but you have to see from the point of view of people who really think they are fighting for a worldwide caliphate and are willing to die for the privilege of trying, that all of our concessions to Muslim sensitivities and grievances and preferences are looked at in a certain way. So are the cartoon controversy and all the self-censorship we practice in that regard, the fact that not a single publication apart from Free Inquiry showed those cartoons in the United States, and Free Inquiry was taken off the newsstands of major bookstores. I mean, the recent Comedy Central censorship of South Park, all of this is viewed as spinelessness from the point of view of our enemies, and we have genuine enemies in the Muslim world. That's not a good thing. And we need to, especially the moderate Muslims, have to be the first people to defend the rights of cartoonists and novelists and dissidents to criticize the faith and to lampoon the Prophet Muhammad publicly. So if the supporters of this mosque were the kinds of people who would say, we can have a Prophet Muhammad cartoon contest, then they might be precisely the kinds of people who should build a mosque near Ground Zero. I doubt they are, but they might be.
Let me put the point to Reza Aslan. The unique sensitivities that Sam Harris is referring to, cartoons mocking Christ, for example, or Abraham would not be removed from public pop culture consumption, but there seems to be a different kind of sensitivity when it comes to Islam in those examples he cited.
Not here in the United States. That's
just what he
true.
was talking about.
In fact, we had.
Wait a minute.
Hang on. Let's establish a factual basis here.
We can talk.
Mr. Aslan, hold on 1 second. Mr. Harris, a few seconds to clarify your point, please.
Yale University Press tried to publish a book, or did in fact publish a book about the cartoon controversy, and wouldn't publish the cartoons. These are utterly benign cartoons.
I am the person who actually edited that book.
Okay, Mr. Aslan?
I am the person who edited the book that Sam is talking about, and I withdrew my endorsement of it because of Yale's decision to remove those cartoons from the book.
So how can you
Look,
say
what's happening in Somalia or in the Sudan or in Gaza or in the Arab world or in these places in which there's this feeling of Western cultural hegemony or oppression, and so they result to violence and they result to lack of tolerance. What does that have to do with the Cordoba Initiative? That's what I want to know. What does anything that Sam has mentioned about Al-Qaeda or about martyrdom or about violence and misogyny in Islam, what does any of this have to do with the Cordoba Initiative?
We have people who try to blow up cars in Times Square.
So my question
communities
to you is,
throughout Western Europe.
What does that have to do with this center?
All right. Can you connect the dots, Mr. Harris?
That's what I'd like to do. I'd like you to connect the dots.
Let's ask him to connect the dots.
We have a single system of ideas that goes by the name of Islam that has been articulated for 1,500 years in a literature that is quite static, that can't be readily edited. You can't go into the Quran and cut out verses that you don't like that are not compatible with modernity. And this is a real problem because this is quite a unified, despite all of the variation that Reza says exists, it is quite unified on some rather indelicate points.
But what does that have to do with the Danish cartoons?
I have to respond to that as the Islamic scholar, as the person with a PhD in Islam in this conversation. The idea that Islam represents a unified system of thought for 1,500 years indicates the profound ignorance.
What is the penalty for apostasy in Islam? Just tell us what it is.
You are. The Quran actually has no.
That's true, but you know the Hadith does, and it has it in spades.
And there are 700,000 Hadiths that people decide which they agree on and which they don't. The fact that you're talking about the most diverse, the most eclectic religion in the history of the world, a religion of 1.5 billion people that's understood in thousands of different ways. The fact that you think it's one thing, that it represents one train of thought and one ideology, shows how little you know about it.
All right, Mr. Harris?
This literature is static. You can't edit these books. These books are acknowledged by all Muslims to be absolutely sacred, and this is a problem in religion generally. I mean, religion does not respond to revision very well, certainly when it's based on sacred texts.
Gentlemen, we have very little time left. I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Mr. Aslan, to tell me what you think the outcome of this controversy will be about the building of this center.
The outcome is set in stone. This is what's so wonderful about America, is that despite the hue and cry, despite the, very clear religious bigotry that is involved in this conversation, there has never been a single moment of doubt that this building was going to be built. It has gotten unanimous approval from people who actually matter, whose approval actually matters, and it's going to be constructed. And 50 years from now, we'll look back on this with some shame And I think we'll laugh at the statements of those who thought that this represents a victory for al-Qaeda.
All right. And Mr. Harris, what do you think is going to be the consequence, the upshot here?
Well, I think it's probably irrelevant what happens with the building. I think what should happen and must happen is that at some point we get to a future where we look back in shame on these kinds of aspersions about bigotry when we're talking about the consequences of ideas. And the belief in martyrdom and jihad is a uniquely bad piece of software to be running on your brain at this moment in human history. And that's something we all have to acknowledge. Muslims have to acknowledge it first, and we're all going to suffer until they do.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. We'll have information about your books and your work on the Pat Morrison page. Sam Harris and Reza Aslan, thank you both.